What's up, guys? Welcome to the first episode of Basics of Scythe, and this episode is going to be regarding top row and bottom row actions, boards, etc. But we're going to first start with the Enlist action. Now, I've been playing a lot of games of Scythe, quite a few in ranked and otherwise. I'm going to discuss my rating and such. If you take a look at the Rust Fades faction video, I actually discuss who I am, etc. I should stop saying that word, really. But we're just going to talk about the Enlist action. The Enlist action is the most powerful bottom row action in the game, and I wasn't convinced of that for a very long time. I thought, deploying mechs, upgrades, both very powerful upgrades save you resources. Deploying mechs gets you a bunch of abilities that allows you to move around the board and actually fight things. Even buildings can get you extra resources the same way Enlists do. But let's examine why the Enlist action is so powerful. Just period. So first off, Enlist gets you 4 different extra resources whenever you or another player next to you takes a bottom row action. Now, what we should first do is actually understand limiting factors in the game of Scythe. Assuming you're not a new player and the other players aren't new players, you're going to be getting 5 or 8 workers in a game, and they're all going to get 5 to 8 workers in their game as well. This means that you're producing 5 to 8 resources every time you take a produce action, at minimum, assuming you don't have a mill. That's a lot of resources. You actually don't need to produce generally more than 5 or 6 times a game, depending on how many, if you want building stars and mech stars and enlist stars, typically you'll produce a little bit more. But you don't need to produce all that often in a game before you have all the resources you need. So this means resources, despite what you may think, and despite how important they are in the early game, is not a limiting factor to you winning the game. So if we don't care so much about resources, we do care about resources. They're important, especially early on. But if we don't care about resources quite as much, if we don't need so many resources in the game to win, assuming we get enough workers to be able to produce, well then what do we care about? We care about doing extra things on our turns. Buildings help us do that. The mine helps us move. The armory and the monuments are quite good for helping us get extra combat power and extra popularity. I've often seen the monuments be one of the strongest buildings. The mill in the very early game, as you're producing to get up to 5 workers, if you can get a mill early, that will allow you to get a bunch of extra resources, or very early on when it matters most. But these aren't really resources that are helping you contribute to reaching stable points in the game, besides the armory and the monument. If we take a look at the bonus resources that lists provide, combat cards is not very good, except if you're Crimea. Crimea being the exception. However, combat cards are somewhat important. Getting 1 or 2 5-powered combat cards means that later on in the game, you can combine 7 and 5 to get the max amount of combat in combat. And since attackers win ties, being able to win ties in a one-on-one combat is going to help you capture more territory because you can use extra moves to spread instead of put 2 mechs on one spot to fight. It's going to allow you to potentially get into multiple fights and win both of them to get multiple stars in a turn. So combat cards are relevant. You do want 1 or 2 5 combat cards in order to make your game a lot easier. You're going to have a little bit harder time, but you don't really need this. What you do need is these 3. And the order you get them in is going to depend on your neighbors. But okay, let's cover these bases. Recruiting power, every time you or your neighbors upgrade, you get a combat power. That's going to translate to about, depending on how early you get this, anywhere between 4 to 8 combat power in a given game. And 4 to 8 combat power is 25 or 50% of the way to a star, in addition to being more able to produce, because production always is going to cost you combat power once you get your 5 workers online, so you can produce more frequently. You can also get into fights more frequently, and you can also more easily like bolster up to a star, or excuse me, one second, or be able to deploy your workers out into the middle of the map much easier, because early game and mid game, if you don't have a lot of combat power, you can't really get out into the board as easy, and if you do, you're always at risk of being sent back to your base. So the extra combat power is also just a deterrent. It allows you to be on those spaces and threaten having to put in a lot of combat power to take you off of that space rather than taking you off it for free. So combat power is really nice. Getting it not only on your actions, which buildings do, but on other people's actions is really nice. Coins for mechs is also really nice. It's going to translate to, it can translate very highly. Typically, you're going to expect a minimum of 5 or 6 coins and a maximum of like 10 coins from this, which is ridiculous. Final scores, I've seen them range above 100 before, but generally they're going to be around the 50 to 70 range. So an extra 10 points is really, really significant, counting for anywhere between like 10 to 20% of your overall score can be gotten off of getting this early. But your neighbors are always going to need to get at least 2 mechs out. That's bare minimum. Oftentimes, Saxony is going to get all their mechs, Rustfate is going to get all their mechs, Crimea is going to get all their mechs, and Nords can, and also Polania can. And mechs is actually one of the easier conditions to get, so oftentimes you're going to have your neighbors build all 4 mechs to get that star, which translates to 4 coins for you. Next is building popularity. Anytime you can get popularity is a time you need to consider doing it. We'll talk about this popularity gain action later, but it's actually one of the better upgrades on the board if you have enough resources. Being able to pick up popularity gain and have your neighbors build buildings, notably if you are neighboring Nords and or Polania, getting this building popularity action will allow you to get anywhere in the range of 2 to 5 popularity in a game, really depending on how many buildings your neighbors are building. 2 to 5 popularity is not as significant as the coins, and generally not as significant as the recruits, but is very noticeable. It can bump you into tier 2 popularity without ever having to take the popularity gain action, which is really, really nice, and can actually score you a lot of points in the end if you're getting that just on the back of having this enlist. And last is the combat cards, which, as we mentioned, are somewhat important. If you have bad combat cards, you can always go to the factory, and there are a lot of factory actions that require combat cards to use. So having extra combat cards is never too big a deal. Now, Enlist, if you just factored in what I said, would already be probably up there in terms of how powerful the action is very early on. Again, getting the early Enlist allows you to get somewhere like 3 extra coins or 2 extra combat power. And if you take a look at the trade-offs, you're trading 3 extra coins or 2 extra combat power. Let's compare it to the upgrade action, which is a very similarly early game sort of thing you want to do. You're trading that off for potentially turns off your production and turns off of needing resources to take bottom row actions. Now upgrades, if you took things at base value, would still be better. Upgrades are costed generally cheaper than enlists on most boards. Upgrades are always either 2 or 3 oil, so that's fairly cheap, and usually the upgrade actions that are 3 oil can be reduced to 2. However, the problem with upgrades is a few things. You're going to want a few upgrades in your early game, which we'll talk about in a separate video. Or we might talk about it in this video. I might just do all the actions, depending on how long this goes. But the problem with upgrades is, first, you need 6 upgrades to get a star. This game is a lot about getting stars, more so than you might think. 6 upgrades to get a star just turns out to be too slow. Taking the same action 6 times and being able to do the bottom row action all 6 times, generally you're actually going to have to take the action with the upgrade on it 8 times to actually get all your upgrades. Which means that it's very, very slow. Considering you're not Rustfate and can't take the same action twice, and you need to take this action generally about 6 to 8 times to get all your upgrades. That's going to be turn 16, turn 19, something around that range at the minimum for you to get all your upgrades, to get the upgrade star. Whereas the enlist star, you only need 4 enlists. That's significantly less actions to actually get the star. In fact, oftentimes on ranked games online, you'll never see people get all 6 upgrades, and you'll almost always see people get all 4 enlists, just because getting 4 of something is so much easier than getting 6 of something. So you do want to get a few upgrades early. That's going to smooth out your game, but you're actually going to want to get all your enlists. And the thing that also bumps enlists better than upgrades, to the point where there are occasional games where I don't even get upgrades, but I always get all 4 enlists, is the fact that you get extra resources for enlisting. Whenever you enlist, you either get 2 combat cards, 2 combat power, 2 popularity, or 2 coins. And if you do all 4 of your enlists in the game, you're going to get all of these. In addition to this and this and this, it's going to translate to something around 7 popularity. Or let's be a little more averagey. 5 popularity, 8 combat strength, let's be fair and call it 11 or 12 coins with the 2 coins here, and 2 combat cards, plus potentially more combat cards later. That's just so many resources, guys. Your games are going to be so much worse if you don't get all your lists off. You're going to be points behind where you should be, and you're not even going to be a real competitor if you can't get lists off in almost every game. The power of enlists is the primary reason why Crimea is, well, it's a prime reason behind why Crimea is so good. Your enlists get you combat cards, and you actually use combat cards for resources. It's a very major role in Rustfate. If you want to go an 8-worker Rustfate game and you get to the center, there's a factory card that allows you to produce on 2 squares for a combat card and a coin. And Rustfate has immediate access with just a Riverwalk mech to both their encounter and food, and it's the primary reason why Saxony actually struggles. You wonder, hey, why does Saxony actually struggle? When I think about it, the abilities of different factions often play a role, but it's never a significant role unless it's these two. Like Polania's is decent, Nordic's is okay, but really just helps them actually play the game. It's basically a neutral ability. So why does Saxony struggle? Well, because Nordics have access to food, Polania has access to food, every faction has access to food, except for Saxony before they get 2 mechs. So it's going to be very slow to get their enlists. So that's why Saxony actually struggles in a lot of games, is because of enlists and because of the power of the enlist action. Personally, if I were to redesign the game somewhat, I would lower these to 1 or maybe even take them out altogether. There's already enough reasons to enlist without having these extra bonuses. These extra bonuses just make it far and away the most important thing to do in the game, is to get all 4 enlists. Anyway, what do you guys think? Do you think I'm overblowing it? Do you think you agree? Just let me know in the comments and I will check those out. I hope you guys enjoyed watching, and I'll be back to talk about some other actions.